your labs, your worm eater lab and the variation lab, we should be at the point where we can now answer questions, and we've decided and learned some things about variations in populations, as well as how different variations kind of work in a population. So what can we conclude about variation from the evidence that we collected in the variation lab? You should be able to determine the fact that not everything is exactly 100% the same. So, for example, in these photos, like all those sunflower seeds are probably not the same length. All those bean pods are probably not the same length. We realized that the volume of each of those pinto beans was not the same. We should have also concluded that the coloration of the pinto beans was not all the same. So not everything is 100% exactly the same. And we're going to add that into our notes. So on our notes, we should have from in box M, what can we conclude from this lab experiment? That there are variations in populations. Variations within variations within populations do exist. Different size peas and different amounts of coloration like exist in the pinto beans. I think that's really all that we needed from the variation lab, because then the next lab is right there. So that was in box M. Just needing to know that variations do exist. And I'll just put underneath there that like within a species, no two so within a species, no two organisms are 100% the same in every way. We're obviously not talking about humans and twins, so just think about like individuals on their own, and don't worry about like the twin situation. We'll talk about that when we get to like DNA and genetics, but for what we're doing right now, that is a good enough answer. So then we went into the next lab. That was the worm eater lab. So we talked about advantageous and disadvantageous traits. So an advantageous trait means the one that is better suited in the environment to live and survive and reproduce. And a disadvantageous trait is one that is not working out well for the environment. It's probably like more conspicuous in the way that maybe a predator is more able to identify it, or it just isn't able to get food as well, that kind of thing. So if we look at these caribou, what do you think will happen to the caribou on the left compared to the one on the right? So the one on the left is an albino caribou. It is white colored, like more white than brown, like the one on the right. And what do you think is going to happen if it's like whiter during like summer and fall and spring? Do you think it's easier to hide in trees and more brown like woods, or do you think it's going to be more spotted? Do you think it's easier to like have a house and like kind of hide from its predators, or do you think that predators are going to be able to see it easier? So which one do you think is an advantageous trait, or which one is the disadvantageous trait? If you said the disadvantageous trait is to be albino because you're more white and you stick out, if you're an albino being, then yes, you are correct. You're probably spotted more. You can't camouflage as well if you were out in the wild. And the advantageous trait then would be to be camouflaged and be more like the caribou on the right. So then what will happen if an individual with an advantageous trait gets to reproduce? So the one with the better suited trait or the advantageous trait, what's going to happen to them if they can reproduce? And what will their offspring look like? Hopefully by now you realize that the one with the better suited trait for the environment, or the one that has the better or the advantageous trait, will pass on their trait to the offspring, because they get more of the food, they get their resources, they're hiding from predators, they're kind of getting all those things that they need, those factors that we talked about. They're able to obtain all of those, and they're able to pass on their traits to their babies or their offspring. So if more individuals with an advantageous trait survive and reproduce, then what do you think is going to happen to the number of individuals born with the advantageous trait in the population? It would probably go up. But what about on the flip side? What about the number of individuals with the disadvantageous trait? So if they're having, let's back up. Before the ones even with the disadvantageous trait have babies, they have to get enough nutrients and they have to survive. So that's the first hurdle that they have to overcome. And then if they do get enough nutrients and they do get to survive, do you think there's more or less of their mates around with the same trait? And then do you think it's going to get passed on? Like, they have to go through so many more hurdles of being able to eat the right food, being able to digest it, being able to hide from their predators, being able to survive a whole year, finding another mate that has the same traits and then passing those on. So what do we think would happen to their population? So we are going to write this down in our notes, kind of our thoughts on which one would go where. So first we're going to talk about or think about what's going to happen to the worm eater with the disadvantageous variation. So the one that got the least amount of worms, what happened to that one? Did it survive and pass on its traits? Did it get to reproduce and have a baby, or did it die out? So based on our lab and what we found, they did die. It's possible to go extinct, but not always going to happen. Possible extinction is a situation that could occur. Not guaranteed. Not a guaranteed extinction, and the population would decrease. Because when they start dying, populations go down. So the death rate increases over the birth rate and it decreases. All right, and then what happened to the worm eater that got the most food? What did they get to do? If we go back and we think about our lab, when they got the most amount of food, they got to have their baby. So that is one thing that they got to do. So produce offspring. And producing offspring leads to a population increase. And that means more of those babies or those individuals, more of the babies have the same trait as the individual that got to have the babies. So that means that trait kind of gets passed on and more survive. All right, so I have the whole lab there. So more individuals with the advantageous trait survive and pass on that better or advantageous trait to their babies. Okay, I think we have one more box here. And let me just make sure we are following along in our notes and I'm not missing anything. All right, so then we were going to return to our model ideas based on what we learned about advantageous and disadvantageous traits. Do we need to add anything to our model? So our model before this was, I don't think I have it in here. I do not. The one before this is, I have it on this computer, so I'll read it really quick. The model we had before this was that there's a change in an environment or weather. We got this from the bird beak gizmos and the reading the graphs. That's what we figured out, that if there's a change in environment or weather that could change the individuals. We figured out that a change in resources like their food or their water could change the individuals. We learned that the better trait survived, so it's not necessarily the strongest trait. We learned that populations change. There's an increase or decrease in birth and death rates, and those that survive pass on their traits to their babies. So I think that covers all of the model ideas. So I'm just going to put those. Oh, they're right here. So we observed the phenomenon that the traits change over time, and we wondered how this happened. We turned to the Finches to seek evidence that may help us answer our question. Based on the evidence, we developed a model to explain trait changes over time, and we further investigated our ideas, revising our model. All right, so we did that, and then we will end up writing our model-based explanation a little bit later, but now let's write this down in our notes. So our model that explains how traits change over time. We have that limiting factors resources lead to a struggle to survive. Populations have variations in traits. So there are so just remember that there's a variety of traits in every organism. Remember, like the beak sizes are not the same, pea size is not the same, that there's like a variation with those histograms. Number 3 is that organisms with the best traits for the environment will survive and reproduce. You guys might have known this as survival of the fittest, so I'll add that in the notes. Number 4 is that the traits, or AKA the best traits, are passed on from parents to offspring, or the babies. AKA, this is done in reproduction. One note that I want us all to remember or think about is, like the finches, for example, did their beaks just all of a sudden get harder and tougher and longer and like grow in size? Like if I was a bird living in the Galapagos Islands when that drought happened, did I just grow my beak in order to eat those harder, tougher seeds? No, I did not. If I had a smaller beak, I probably died. And then my life is over. I ended, lay there in the dust, turned to dust, whatever. And the ones that were able to eat were the ones that just passed on more traits. So it's not that an individual can stretch a beak or stretch a neck or change its colors. Like if I'm a ladybug or the peppered moth that you guys just read about, if I'm a peppered moth, can I just say, oh crap, someone's going to see me if I have this light color and I don't match the tree. I'm just going to sit here and think really hard and change into a gray moth. No, they can't just change their spots or their colors. The ones with the disadvantageous trait die out. And it just becomes more prevalent that the one with the better trait survives because they just are able to survive more and then they reproduce and then they pass on that trait more. So we'll get into that in another activity, but I just want to add this to our notes so that you guys are reminded of it. So just remember, individuals cannot change their traits in their lifetime. They either live or die. Perfect. Okay. So that is it for all of our notes for this unit. Please, please, please do not turn them in. You're going to have 2 kind of assignments or like a lab or a simulation where you can use these notes. So I do not grade your notes. You guys know that. Sometimes I do note checks. But these are for you to use on tests and things. So when it says, what is our model? You're going to use box P to answer our model and things like that. So do not turn these in. If you do turn them in, just unsubmit them when you need them because I do not grade them. And they are for you. So we will be wrapping up this. We will be wrapping up this unit, and that is all. We'll be moving on to DNA and genetics soon.